Hey you and welcome. My name is Mike, and in this whole video, my friends, we are going somewhere we've never ventured before, and that is the beautiful, it looks like on TV, country of South Korea. I'm pretty excited about this, not gonna lie. I mean, I suppose not sure if I should be, because, well, you know. This is a long story, went on for quite some time, beginning in the 80s, ending in 2020. Twists and turns galore. I'd say they should make a movie of it. They have, and the movie is real good, but the movie is like less crazy than what actually happened in real life. And that is something I'll tell you about right now. Via me, you know, butchering the pronunciations of Korean names and places. So, look forward to that. Let's give it a go. It is to Hwaseong we're off to, a city about an hour south of capital Seoul. It is a rural enough city in Gyeonggi province. Primarily known for agriculture, Hwaseong is really the breadbasket of Seoul. It would be known for rice farming along the floodplains, though recently it has seen a factory boom. Today, it has a population of over 600,000 people. But we're not going to be talking about today, at least not yet. No, we're going to go back about 30 years, when Hwaseong was a bit more agricultural than it is today, but you still had, like, factories and farms right beside each other. Perfect place for a serial killer to come and go as they pleased. And for 5 years, they did. In 1988, the people of Hwaseong lived in constant fear. The constant fear was reinforced, you know, on the morning of the 17th of September, when another weight was added. That morning, 14-year-old girl named Park Sang-hee was found murdered in her own bed, in her family home. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Park Sang-hee was not the first victim. No, far from it. She was actually victim number 8. But it might have been the worst one up until that point, due to her age and the fact that she was attacked in her own bed, with just a wall separating her from her parents, who slept through the entire thing. This was a grim reminder of who was out there. Something that had been, you know, out there for 2 years at this point. Almost 2 years to the day previous, on the 15th of September 1986, 71-year-old Lee Wan-im was on her way home from visiting her daughter. And as she was walking home on a quiet country road in Anyangdong, she was attacked. Her naked body was found 4 days later in a rice field, not far from her home. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. So this was number 1. And as to who could have done this, there was no evidence left behind. This instantly became the talk of this quiet, simple, you know, country town. And as that talk, you know, started to die down, happened again. On October 20th, 1986, 25-year-old Park Hyun-suk got off the bus from town at about 10 p.m. She disappeared straight after as she walked home that dark night. On the 23rd of October, her body was found in a canal. Once again, same modus operandi, sexually assaulted and strangled to death. So that's 2 victims within a month of each other. You know, the bodies were discovered 15 minutes apart. Both assaulted and killed in the same way. Not exactly hidden, their bodies were left not far from where they were attacked, pretty much like out in the open. Little to no evidence was also left behind this time, though they did find a trace of semen. This was the 80s though, so, you know, there wasn't really much you could do other than... yeah, that's that alright. And then 2 months later, dread returned. On the 12th of December, a housewife, 25-year-old Kwon Jung-bon, disappeared from her neighborhood. The same neighborhood the first victim was murdered in. She wasn't found for 4 months, and this time when she was found, it was the same story. She'd been gagged with her stockings, her underwear was over her face, and bodily fluid was once again found on her. 2 days after Jung-bon went missing, on the 14th of December, 23-year-old Lee Kai-suk got off a bus from town. Last seen walking home at 11 p.m. A week later, her body was found in a rice field. Hands tied behind her back, girdle over her head. Definite pattern was beginning to emerge here, and everybody started shitting bricks, right? There was definitely a serial killer amongst them, somewhere in like this rural enough area. Women walking home alone at night, not a good idea, but then again, one of the victims was taken from pretty much like right outside her house. She wasn't walking home, she was home, so they were kind of fucked either way. Police were, scratching their noggin, not doing much, and the local people who were, obviously absolutely terrified, they started looking for comfort and help from other sources beside the authorities, who seemed useless. Shamanism was turned to for protection from this bastard, and the police, growing frustrated and knowing people were frustrated with them, began to turn to violence themselves. During the entire investigation, police looked into more than 20,000 people as possible suspects. They spent millions of man-hours on the case, with jack shit to show for it. And so, desperate times lead to desperate measures. You did it though, didn't you? Come on. You can tell me all, buddy. We'll share a glass of soju and you can tell me all about it. That kind of shite began to happen. They would drag people into the police station to have the shite kicked out of them. People who were just scared out of their wits, mentally disabled. Anybody is like, you did it, you fucker, you did it. Over the next couple of years, 4 people who had been basically interrogated by the police would take their own lives. And it believed to be, due to the assaults by the police, the stalking, the harassment the police were doing on people they thought could be the serial killer. So quite a few things weren't done the right way. And as we will see later, quite a few things that should have been said weren't by the pack of bastards. But the killer was still, out and about. On the 11th of January 1987, 19-year-old high school student Hong Jin-young was found dead in a rice field. She was last seen the night before, just about 9 p.m, when she got off the bus. Jin-young was once again tied up, gagged with her socks, and sexually assaulted. She was then strangled to death with her own clothing. After time, well, as I said, superstition started kind of returning to the area. People believe the killer was targeting women wearing red, like a bull. If you wore red, Jesus, you're fucked. Sorry, you made the list. And so nobody, especially women, they stopped wearing red altogether around this time in hopes of avoiding a brutal encounter. Unfortunately, the killer wasn't so picky. On the 2nd of May, 29-year-old Park Eun-ju went missing while delivering an umbrella to her husband. She was found a week later, on a hill, same condition as the previous victims. And throughout this entire time, there were a number of sexual assaults in the area committed by the killer. They knew this because the modus operandi was the same. He would put their underwear over their heads, only he didn't kill them. It would then go quiet for a few months. Spring turned to summer, turned to autumn, but the dread never left. Then, on the 8th of September 1987, he struck again. This time, 54-year-old An Gi-soon. She had, once more, gotten off the bus and was walking home when she was attacked. Her body later found in a canal. It was at this point, once more, a woman attacked while she was walking home off the bus. It seemed like the killer was taking the piss. It seemed like he was just making a mockery of the police. He could come and go. He could do whatever he wanted. And he knew it. They would have undercover, female police officers out there wearing red, walking around a place at night. Hey, look at me. He never once fell for it. However, they were getting somewhat closer. A sketch was made of the possible killer, based on a description from the bus driver who dropped off An Gi-soon, and this was reinforced by survivors of sexual assaults in the area. The man was in his mid to late 20s. He was 165 to 170 centimeters tall, He had a sharp nose and neatly cut short hair. One survivor also added the man's hands were soft. She remembered that from when he placed his hands around her mouth during the attack. Now, most people who lived in that area would be, blue-collar, manual labor workers. So a guy would, soft hands. Yeah, that would stand out. And so these posters went up everywhere. That probably scared the bejesus out of the killer because for an entire year, he didn't strike again. Until when we go back to where I started this story. In September 1988, when 14-year-old Park Sang-hee was brutally attacked in her own bedroom. And this is when they finally got a break in the case, right? Finally, after 2 years of constant attacks. And it led to a man named Yoon Sung-yeol. Sung-yeol was 22 years old, living in one of the villages in Hwaseong. He had a limp and worked at a local farming machine repair shop. He got the laser eyes from the cops, right? And when the police found a pubic hair at the crime scene of Park Sang-hee, it was determined there was a 40% chance of being Sung-yeol's. So, 40%, is that even a pass mark on an exam? I mean, 40% means probably not, but there you go. He was taken into an interrogation room and held for 3 days. And he confessed to the murder of 14-year-old Park Sang-hee. According to himself, that night he was out and about for a walk with his limp, and then he saw a light emerging from a house. He said he felt, quote, an urge to rape, and in he went. That was that. And he was charged with the murder. A murder, 1 of 8. They tried to see if he was related to the other 7. At this point, nothing. Didn't seem like that at all. And in fact, 2 more murders would occur while he was actually in custody. Yoon Sung-yeol was determined to be a copycat killer. Obviously a big fan of the real killer, known as the Hwaseong killer, or also called the Korean Zodiac killer. So that's 1 of 8 solved. Getting there, in November 1990, 14-year-old Kim Mi-jun's body was found on a hill. This was, it had been 2 years since a murder, 3 years since, the police believed the actual serial killer struck. And it seemed like he had been saving up. Kim Mi-jun's hands and feet were tied together, her bra used as a gag, and multiple items were used to assault her, including a ballpoint pen, a fork, and a razor blade. 5 months later, in April 1991, 69-year-old Kwon Soon-sang was last seen, you know the drill, getting off a bus. Her body was found the next day, and from how it was found, it was clear who was behind this. Same guy, almost 5 years later, still out there. From there, things would go quiet for a couple of years, right? Until there would be another murder. Not in Hwaseong though, this time. This time it was in a place called Cheongju, about 2 hours southeast. There, I would like you to give a good ol' annyeonghaseyo to a guy named Lee Choon-Jae. On the 18th of January, 1994, Lee Choon-Jae was arrested for the sexual assault and murder of his 18-year-old sister-in-law. Apparently, Chun-Jae's wife left him, and so, a few weeks later, he lured his sister-in-law over, drugged her, assaulted her, and then killed her. He then disposed of her, hiding her under a tarp at the back of his shop. When people went looking for her, Lee Choon-Jae was a great man, he was a big help. When her body was finally discovered a few days later, Lee Choon-Jae became suspect number 1 and, arrested. After he asked the police, here, come here, dude. Just shooting the shit off the dome. How many years do you serve for rape and murder in South Korea? Curious. He was arrested, charged, and found guilty of her murder. He was sentenced to death in May 1994, but this was later reduced to life. Possible parole after 20. So who was Lee Choon-Jae really? an absolute monster, wearing human skin. He was born on the 31st of January 1963 in Hwaseong. He was quiet as a boy, even quieter after his sister died of drowning when he was very young. He was allegedly sexually abused as a kid, not much is known there. He finished high school in 1983, entered the military as part of the conscription they have in Korea. It's mandatory to spend between 18 and 21 months in the military. Lee Choon-Jae would become a tank driver, and he was out of the army in 1986, January of that year. He went home after he got out of the army, and the first murder would occur in Hwaseong 8 months later. So after he left the military, he seemed alright, happy out, doing alright. He was really anything but. After leaving the military, he had no drive in his life. He just had an urge, and he had fantasies, both of which would get stronger and stronger. In February 1986, he would go out at night, dressed in black, waiting for vulnerable women to show up. Unfortunately, they did. And over the next few months, he would assault over half a dozen women. Eventually, sexually assaulting them wasn't enough, and in September 1986, he would become, or set off on the road to becoming, a serial killer. As I said, right, he would finally be arrested in 1994 for the murder of his sister-in-law, but he wouldn't be linked to the Hwaseong murders until much later. It was in 2019 that forensic science caught up with him. He was still incarcerated at the time, his profile in the system, but he refuted that he had anything to do with those serial killings. But it wasn't just DNA they had at the time pointing to him being what's called the Korean Zodiac killer. In 1989, he was arrested for breaking and entering. He got a year and a half for that. During that time, there was no murders. He also lived, at the time of the serial killings, with his wife in a house right smack dab in the middle of the danger zone. He didn't want to go too far for his hunting ground. He would eventually confess to being the killer, probably the most famous in Korean history. He would also confess to 4 more murders, bringing his total to 15. So that is the 10 Hwaseong victims from 86 to 91, then his sister-in-law in 1994, and in between all that, there was another 4 people he killed.
The Gyeonggi Nambu Provincial Police Agency said Wednesday that the suspect in a string of murders in Hwaseong City in the 1980s has confessed to the killings that shook the nation at the time. Police had been investigating the prime suspect after the National Forensic Service found that DNA collected from the underwear of one of the victims matched the suspect's DNA. The male suspect in his 50s is currently in prison for murdering his sister-in-law. He initially denied being the Hwaseong City murderer but finally confessed in the face of mounting evidence including new DNA matches and witness accounts. He also says he committed another 5 murders and police are looking to verify his claims.
In December 1987, he murdered 18-year-old Kim Mi-soon in Suwon, north of Hwaseong. In July 1989, he took 8-year-old Kim Hyun-jung. She's never been found. Then, 17-year-old Park Soon-ja in January 1991 in Cheongju. And also in Cheongju, 27-year-old Kim Jin-ah in March 1991. He also confessed to over 30 sexual assaults. By the way, you'll notice that I said 10 murders in Hwaseong, right? That's because in 2019, Lee Choon-Jae was in court. Not for himself. He was a witness at the retrial of Yoon Sung-yeol, who killed the 14-year-old Park Sang-hee. Or did he? He confessed, right back then. He confessed under great duress. You might too, if the police did to you what they did to him.
저 같은 사람이 안 나오길 바라는 뿐이고 모든 이 공정한 재판이 이루어졌으면 하는 제 바람입니다.
Since Yoon was confirmed innocent, he will receive criminal compensation for his 20 years after being imprisoned. And it is estimated that Yoon will receive compensation of up to 1.76 billion won when multiplying the amount of compensation per day and the number of days in custody. According to the Korean Herald, Yoon said he has forgiven Lee as well as the police officers who tortured him. He said, "I had to make peace with the past and the people who wronged me and accept the fact that some things can't be changed so that I can move on."
Immediately after he confessed, he denied it, said he had nothing to do with anything. That fell on deaf ears. He said he had been intimidated and tortured. It didn't matter. He was still sent away for 20 years.
기억을 못해요. 근데 자식이 어떻게 되는지도 몰라. 그래가지고 그 생각이 지금도 나진 않아요. 하루 이틀 잠 못 자잖아요. 아무 생각이 안 나요. 근데 자고 싶다는 생각이 안 들어. 계속 잘 된다면서도 자면은 가서 깨우고 차는 잠 못 자. 물 먹고 빵 쪼가리 한두 개 먹고 하루 버티겠어요? 못 버텨요. 그래가지고 내가 뭔 얘기를 했는지도 생각이 안 난다는 거예요.
In 2019, Lee Choon-Jae would confess to killing 14-year-old Park Sang-hee in her room. He described it in great detail. There never was a copycat killer, just the actual killer. An actual killer who would, actually, come out and say he couldn't believe it took them that long to catch him. He said he never really tried to hide from the cops. Quote, "I still don't understand why I wasn't a suspect. Crimes happened around me and I didn't try hard to hide things, so I thought I would get caught easily. There were hundreds of police forces. I bumped into detectives all the time, but they always asked me about people around me. There was one occasion where I was brought into the police station after being searched, but I was never put on the list of suspects. There were multiple occasions in which I could have been caught, and I don't understand why I never was." He really could not believe the incompetence of the police. And guess what else you won't believe? Lee Choon-Jae will never face prosecution, conviction for any of the murders he did in Hwaseong.
But even if the suspect was the murderer in the infamous Hwaseong case, he will not be punished for those crimes as the statute of limitations expired in April 2006. The serial killings received renewed national attention when the case was made into 2003 movie Memories of Murder. Over 20,000 people were investigated for those murders, a figure that hasn't been broken since.
He'll get off those 10 scot-free because the statute of limitations expired in 2006. Yoon Sung-yeol was released in 2009. However, he'll never get those 20 years he spent behind bars. Falsely, back in 2019, he was acquitted when the real killer confessed to everything. 8 of the original investigators who did him in back then were later charged with abuse of power and stripped of their titles. That wasn't the only shitty thing the cops did. One of the additional murders Lee Choon-Jae confessed to was that of 8-year-old Kim Hyung-jung in 1989. Her body was never found. Or at least that's what the police said. Yeah, her body had actually been found by the police back then, but they covered it up. They also hid some of her belongings and never told anyone, especially not her desperate parents. When they found her, it was obvious she had been murdered, but the police let it remain a missing persons case, so they wouldn't have to do much about it. This only came out when Lee Choon-Jae confessed. Again, 2 police officers were charged when it all came out. Due to the statute of limitations, nothing can be done. Lee Choon-Jae is definitely not the only criminal in this old one. He's definitely the worst, for sure. He never showed any remorse for the 15 people he murdered. And he will die behind bars for all the horror he committed. Victims left behind. Victims like Yoon Sung-yeol, spending 2 decades behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, and the parents of Kim Hyung-jung who are waiting 30 years for their daughter to come home. A lot of tragedy in this one. And there you have it. Chun-jae. If you're interested in this case, I guess there's a South Korean movie based on it. It's called Memories of Murder.
근데 서울에서도 이런 거 자주 보나? 전혀.
I'd recommend the movie, it's good, and what's funny about it is that it came out in 2003, so over 10 years after the murders were committed, but before they knew who was behind it, before Lee Choon-Jae was found responsible for them. What's super interesting about it is that they actually got a lot of things right. about who the killer would be. And it was done by your man who made Parasite, Bong Joon-ho. Memories of Murder ends with the main character staring at the camera, looking at the killer in the audience, who, when the movie was released, was still out there, haunting South Korea for some time. I wonder what he thought of it. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with me. Here you go, and I'll see you as always real soon in the next L1. Until then, please look after yourselves. I love you. Mike out.